You know what's weird about Metroid Fusion? The wall jump and shine spark are taught to the player on the attract screen. It feels like an odd place to put something so critical to completion, especially the wall jump. On the other end of the spectrum is the story. While the designers decided to bury mission-critical information on something most people will skip, they went and over-explained the plot. It didn't bother me Samus had to reacquire power-ups in both Metroid 2 and Super Metroid. It is a video game. I don't really need to know how she keeps losing them between adventures, and quite frankly, I don't care. Much like the Force in Star Wars, I don't need to know how it works, because the explanation provided can never surpass the ambiguity of it all. But Metroid Fusion decided to explain how Samus lost her powers instead of just let it be, and thus the biggest change to Metroid Fusion is immediately present. This game has a story to tell, and there will be plenty of text for players to read. While exploring SR-388, Samus finds herself attacked and infected by an X-parasite. Her power suit is compromised and mostly removed, and a vaccine utilizing Metroid DNA is formulated to rid her nervous system of the pesky critters. With her power suit gone, most of her abilities are now gone as well, giving a lengthy explanation as to why Samus is starting with minimal power-ups yet again. It is an interesting and perhaps ambitious strategy for the designers to dive in and offer explanations for everything in the game world. Sadly, this trend of over-explaining every plot detail carries through to the very end of the adventure. Anyway, while Samus has previously explored planets, her latest mission takes place on a Federation research station which has been rocked by a large explosion. From here, the next biggest change to the Metroid formula is quickly realized. Samus is no longer working on a solo mission. Instead, she is taking orders from the Federation and is in frequent contact with an AI who guides her along from checkpoint to checkpoint. For gamers looking for a more open experience where the path forward isn't always clear, the structural change may make Metroid Fusion a non-starter. However, as I'm a fan of the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise, which bounces between sticking with dated mechanics for about 2 games too long, to quickly abandoning promising concepts before they have a chance to mature, I'm willing to give the changes an honest chance and not write anything off too quickly. So yeah, Metroid Fusion doesn't play like the console Metroids, where there is a large playground for players to mess about in. Instead, it is structured more like Metroid 2, where there are smaller sandboxes for the player to explore before moving on to the next one. The first sandbox is the main deck. Here, the player learns Samus can now hang onto ledges. A small change, but it will give her a leg up on her main antagonist later. The jumping also finally feels different. One of my main gripes with the Metroid franchise has been the floaty jump, which doesn't make sense when the game occasionally forces tight platforming segments onto the player. In Metroid Fusion, Samus's jump is significantly less floaty, likely to compensate for the reduced screen resolution, but it makes her feel like a nimble bounty hunter, and I welcome the tightened mechanics. The rest of the mechanics are similar. For example, the player will come across areas where the morph ball is clearly needed, but the ability is not yet available. Typical Metroidvania design concepts. The AI tells the player to visit the quarantine bay, and after investigation, the player is then told to visit another area on the screen where the X are gathering. It turns out the X can imitate any creature they come in contact with, except Samus, who is now immune. I have to assume the mission-based structure is due to the portable nature of the game. If a designer assumes the player will be playing in quick 10 to 30-minute bursts, it is possible a player might forget what they are doing between play sessions. The navigation rooms and targets on the map screen allow players to quickly pick up where they left off. I found this slightly obtrusive on my initial playthrough, as I am not playing this on a portable, but on my recorded run, already knowing the story, I appreciated the dialogue significantly more. The mood in Metroid Fusion slowly evolves throughout the runtime. Initially, the AI seems generally concerned with the X-parasites breaking out of quarantine and wants Samus to neutralize the threat. The AI even guides the player to a data room to obtain the missiles needed to break the boss room door. It is a helping hand for Samus. However, the game doesn't hold the player's hand through everything. Once in the operations room, electrical interference has knocked out the elevators. The player has to find an alternate route out of the room without AI guidance. Here, Metroid Fusion uses sound to offer the player a hint. The hollow sound is a clue for the player to utilize their upgrade to move forward. This brings us to the first of many boss fights. My second main complaint of the Metroid franchise has been the boss battles. Most could be defeated by spamming a weapon, and little strategy was ever required to defeat them. While I don't think they ruined the games, as the Metroid franchise's strength of puzzle and map design easily overshadows these shortcomings, but it is still a blemish. Metroid Fusion thankfully puts significantly more thought into the boss design. This is immediately apparent with the first encounter. The player actually has to dodge the incoming fire, memorize a basic pattern to get off a couple of shots, and learn the boss's behavior in order to have a chance at victory. This isn't the best boss of the era by any stretch, but offers a more engaging experience than mashing buttons. Upon defeating the boss, which is a host of sorts for the X-Parasites and the X-Parasite itself, the player is rewarded with the Morph Ball, and can now reach the next areas of the BSL space station. I mentioned before Metroid Fusion offers a series of small sandboxes for the players to explore instead of one contiguous world. The BSL has 6 different breeding environments, or sectors, and the repetition from the main deck repeats during the first half of the game. Arrive at a sector, reach an objective, beat a boss, and then go where the AI instructs. Some have called this the beginning of Subservient Samus, and where the series began its decline. Prior to arriving at the first breeding environment, however, a cutscene plays. It seems the X-Parasites have commandeered Samus's old power suit, wreaking havoc on the ship and quite possibly hunting Samus. It appears the main foe is in possession of all of those hard-earned upgrades obtained in Super Metroid. A most curious development. Another curious development is that Sector 1 is a simulated SR388 environment, home of the Metroid. I didn't question this on my first playthrough. After all, SR388 is home to all sorts of creatures scientists might want to research. However, upon reflection, one might find themselves wondering what the true nature of this entire station is. Following the plot of Alien Resurrection, it is clear the Federation is hell-bent on exploring the military application of every creature in the galaxy. But back to the game structure. Metroid Fusion still rewards observant players with goodies and upgrades. Near the beginning, the player climbs a ladder, shoots at clearly marked walls to open the path forward. This clues the player to shoot the wall on a ladder, even when the wall is not marked. In other words, the player is being taught game world skills. Speaking of progression, the player is next instructed to go to Sector 2, a tropical breeding environment. It is here where Metroid Fusion begins easing off the direct commands. Players are instructed to find a security room to unlock level 1 security doors. This is a subtle change to the formula, which previously used weapon upgrades as a means to open up higher security doors, but still functions as progression gating, preventing players from reaching areas they aren't supposed to yet. In any case, the security rooms are not marked on the map. Instead, the player has to explore and find them on their own. What is marked on the map is the data room containing the next weapon upgrade. So savvy players should figure out to head down the opposite path, rewarding clever players. After unlocking the gate and obtaining the bomb upgrade, the player will hear an explosion. This explosion knocks out one of the doors, preventing the player from exiting Sector 1 the same way they arrived. One of my favorite elements of Metroid Fusion is how the world is always changing. Doors are disabled and pieces of the world are destroyed. This not only gives a sense of a passage of time, but is a constant reminder the SAX is just ahead or behind Samus, giving a sense of tension. This is something that wasn't quite captured in Super Metroid, with the main antagonist only appearing at the beginning and end of the quest, and not much happening during the middle. In Metroid Fusion, there is a constant reminder that Samus is not at the top of the food chain, and until she regains all of the functionality of the power suit, she stands no chance to rid the world of the X. After conquering the boss of Sector 2, Samus is again reminded of the SAX before venturing off to Sector 4. This reminds me of a few things I really dig about Metroid Fusion. First, there is a lot of variety in the environments, specifically the color palettes. Metroid and Super Metroid felt relatively dark, and Metroid 2 obviously had limitations due to the hardware. Metroid Fusion is far more visually interesting, with a greater variety of color, vastly superior backgrounds with far less repeating, and a greater lived-in feel with a good good mix of nature mixed with industry. Granted, the previous planets may have been more suited to their local inhabitants, but I find the overall level of detail is a massive leap forward. I also love how the sectors loop back on themselves. Despite each sector of the space station acting like a mini Metroidvania game, the level of care in each sector is still incredibly thoughtful. After bringing the 5th air stabilizer online in Sector 1, the player is near the entrance, with backtracking greatly reduced. Same goes for Sector 2. After obtaining the high jump boots, the player is brought up through a completely different area to reach the exit, reducing backtracking and clearly showing the player how the new power-up works. And in Sector 4, this trend continues. The speed booster is needed to lower the electrified water and ultimately return the player to the sector's entrance on an all-new path. The level of care put into the game world remains extremely high, and while some may dislike the checkpoint-to-checkpoint progression style, Metroid Fusion's game world is still meticulously designed. With that, Samus is off to Sector 3, first to release the level 2 security doors, and then to the target to download super missiles. Same as before, the security room is not shown, and the player will have to find it, which isn't exactly obvious, a good thing. More interestingly, the super missiles are not a selectable item once obtained. Instead, they are an upgrade. One thing I didn't mention in the Super Metroid video was how slow it was to select items. It often didn't matter, but the player had to take their eyes off the action to be sure the correct item was selected, and then press the Y button to engage or disengage the weapon. Running was also mapped to the B button. As the Game Boy Advance only has 2 face buttons instead of 4, the entire button layout had to be rethought. The left trigger is now held to activate the missiles or power bomb, eliminating the item selection toggles completely. This does mean items like the grapple beam and X-ray scope are eliminated, but I can't say I missed them. The power bombs reveal many of the secrets on the screen, and because its use is limited, it feels more balanced. And if one is being honest, the grapple beam wasn't exactly the most responsive mechanic in Super Metroid anyway. Lastly, the run or dash button is eliminated, with Samus simply having 1 speed. With the reduced horizontal resolution, I don't have a problem with this change. There is only one downside to the control changes, and that is aiming diagonally down requires an extra button press, but I think the overall trade-off of a drastically simplified control scheme easily outweighs the slightly reduced item set. Moving on, after clearing the boss and obtaining another upgrade, the player is treated to some narrative that Samus is not privy to. The Federation asks the AI if Samus suspects anything. If one is paying close attention, they might notice the AI was hesitant to release level 4 locks earlier. One might assume the AI doesn't want the X-parasites to spread into sensitive areas, or one might suspect the Federation is keeping information from Samus. From here, the player is off to Sector 6. The difficulty really ramps up here too. With the Metroid vaccine, Samus can be damaged by cold, much like the Metroid. There are cold X-parasites here, and Samus cannot absorb them. Instead, they must be avoided. Outside of the SAX, nothing in Metroid Fusion really has to be avoided, and I appreciate the added wrinkle to the combat. After defeating the boss and obtaining the Various suit, Samus can then visit the areas with a large number of cold X, thanks to the Various suit eliminating Samus's weakness. And with that, Samus is ordered to the final breeding habitat, Sector 5. This went very smoothly for me on my recorded playthrough. However, on my initial run, I actually got stuck in a pretty bad way. You see, Metroid Fusion likes to destroy the environment, preventing the player from backtracking, forcing one on a path forward. Metroid Fusion also has a ton of save rooms, presumably because this is a handheld game and the designers wanted to let players play in quick bursts and then shut the game off. The problem is, the placement of these roadblocks and save rooms isn't always thoughtful. On my first playthrough, I saved at this save room with just 3 hit points remaining. Little did I know, there would be very few enemies to grind health on, and the enemies that were available shot projectiles from off the screen, putting me in an awful death loop. This happened to me a second time near the end of the adventure. The only enemies prior to the Ridley fight are these things, which don't drop a ton of health. On my initial playthrough, it took around 10 minutes to restore 10 tanks worth of health, giving me flashbacks to the original game. Neither Metroid 2 nor Super Metroid would gate off backtracking in this way, meaning the player could always venture to a health restore point, and I wish Metroid Fusion wouldn't have been so restrictive.
Emergency in Sector 3. Emergency in Sector 3.
With all 6 sectors restored, Metroid Fusion shifts gears. The research station issues an emergency warning indicating a problem in Sector 3. It appears a cooling unit has gone offline, and if the station overheats, it may self-destruct. The player has 6 tense minutes to get there and bring the cooling units back online. Fusion then offers something for the player to ponder. Why would the X want the ship to self-destruct? After all, it would likely destroy them all. Second, why does the Federation want to stop the ship from self-destructing? Most of the ship's wildlife have been overrun with the parasites. It seems like Samus escaping on her craft would be the ultimate win-win situation. The only thing I can assume is the cooling unit malfunction is a trap, meant to lure Samus in so that X can eliminate her. Subtext. Next, Metroid Fusion sort of wastes the player's time. Samus is finally allowed to return to the main deck and free some animals Super Metroid fans should be familiar with. This ultimately sets up for a surprise at the end of the game. With all of the sectors explored, Metroid Fusion then loops the player back through the world a second time. At first, this feels like more of the same, going back to Sector 5 to obtain the power bomb, and then back to the main deck. However, something awesome happens. The elevator stops, and most of the doors are stuck in the closed position. The player is now tasked with finding a way out of this predicament without the AI giving it away. In fact, much of the second half of Metroid Fusion is far more cryptic, and I mean this in the best of ways. The game has more or less taught the player all of the skills they need to finish the mission, and it is now up to them to explore, solve puzzles, and defeat an ever more hostile array of enemies to succeed. This isn't to say the game design stops, like in the NES game, but the second half of Metroid Fusion offers a much greater challenge than anything found in the series thus far. This starts with figuring out how to restore power to the main reactor core. There are no doors, and the map is basically a blank canvas. The player is left to use the power-ups recovered up to this point to figure it out. However, even after reaching the navigation point, only auxiliary power is restored. The player still has to find a way forward without the aid of a map. One must use the environmental clues to find the path. Metroid Fusion also does a wonderful job creating tension. Up to this point, the player would often see the SAX, but didn't have to interact with it, until this point where the player actually has to engage. Samus cannot inflict damage yet, but can freeze the foe. The player then has to strategically freeze the enemy, giving a few moments to unlock doors and repeat the process. It is a stressful moment and creates more dread than any point in the game thus far. Even with the countdowns, there isn't a real fear of death, but here, Samus can get wiped out very quickly if the player is not careful, creating a true sense of fear and urgency. After restoring full power to the space station, the player finally reunites with the AI, who is surprised Samus has restored the plasma beam capability. For the most part, the AI stops acting like a guide for the player and seamlessly transitions more as a storytelling element. The AI doesn't say it is annoyed at Samus for acquiring the new ability, but if you read between the lines, it is clear the power balance is shifting in Samus's favor. Sticking with the theme of less hand-holding, the player needs to find the next boss battle on their own, and defeating said boss will grant Samus the gravity suit. However, as the SAX is continuing to trash the space station, the player cannot simply return to the navigation room to progress, and again, the player must explore to find the way forward. After unlocking the level 4 security latches and upgrading the missiles one last time, the AI is concerned with Samus's ambition, but seems to let it slide so Samus can chase down yet another boss. And it is here where Samus finally breaks free from being a subservient soldier and becomes a badass bounty hunter. With the wave beam obtained from yet another boss encounter, Samus can finally unlock doors from the wrong side, and what happens next harkens back to the series' roots. There is no text, only subtext. The Federation clearly has lied about the nature of the biologic space laboratory. They are breeding Metroids and letting them evolve through their various states. The player can also see them attacking the SAX, further cementing the fact that X do have a weakness. This is all shared with the player visually, and I appreciate how everything in Metroid Fusion is progressing as the adventure winds down. After the restricted zone gets jettisoned into oblivion, the AI expresses frustration with Samus's continued defiance. Samus has gained her independence. With that, Samus has a fight with a recreated Ridley, which can exist because of the X copying the DNA of the frozen sample seen earlier, which rewards the screw attack, the final upgrade needed to take down the SAX. Only, the AI won't let Samus leave the nav room. Again, paying homage to the classic Alien franchise, the Federation wants the SAX alive so they can use it as a weapon. Samus and the player obviously know this is a terrible idea, and Samus would prefer to blow up the space station, but the AI doesn't budge. It is here where I feel the story of Metroid Fusion stumbles. Early on, Samus recalls taking orders from Adam, her old commanding officer. During this moment of confinement, she calls the AI Adam, which seems to trigger the human element of the AI, and it then agrees to help her. If I'm honest, it seems really dumb. The setup and payoff are hokey, and while I appreciate the effort into real narrative, it isn't believable. It would have made sense for the AI to help Samus because she is correct, or she escaped confinement and continued the mission solo. As it stands, this revelation feels forced and is ultimately a letdown. As alluded to earlier, the over-explaining feels ridiculous. In any case, Adam advises the ship needs to be vaporized in the planet's atmosphere to assure the destruction of the X. Before altering the ship's flight path, there is the climactic battle with the SAX, and much like Super Metroid, this is actually very easy compared to the Ridley fight. However, it is reasonably designed. There is a pattern to learn, a rhythm to get into, both offensively and defensively, in order for the player to be successful. It isn't just a war of attrition like the series relied on in the past, and I found the encounter rather engaging, even if it is a bit on the easy side. In fact, the bosses are generally better in Metroid Fusion, although inconsistent. Some are just frustrating, like the spider boss. If it grabs Samus, the entire battle can quickly escalate into an endless loop of being grabbed, and Samus's health quickly draining while the player struggles to break out of the loop. The boss is terrible, and first-time players will likely struggle trying to find the correct strategy. None of the other bosses have this death loop, thankfully, but some haven't evolved past the previous games. Samus moves so fast there's little hope for the player to actually anticipate the attacks and react appropriately. It just doesn't match the limited screen real estate offered on the GBA. The screen real estate problem continues with the large core X, but at least the boss moves at a reasonable speed. Hopefully the player notices missiles bounce off it too. Others are just wars of attrition. Once the weak spot of Nightmare is determined, just blast it with missiles and it will go down. I think the space jump is supposed to be utilized to dodge it, but even failing miserably at dodging won't result in failure. Just blast away. And there is this giant plant boss. Just fire away with missiles until its second form, where it then thankfully requires a little pattern recognition to come out victorious. With Ridley, I didn't even try to avoid being grabbed, as it really didn't matter and eliminates the need for the player to aim their shot. Despite not playing with any defense at all, I came out victorious with half my life bar to spare. Quite disappointing. There are good fights though. The opening battle with Arachnus requires pattern recognition and quick reflexes to sneak in an attack while avoiding projectiles. Both fights with the security robot are decent enough, though not perfect. The key is to hang on the ladder to get at the boss's weak point, while avoiding jump attacks and projectile attacks. It has a bit of sloppiness to it, but overall it feels thoughtful. Even the Pogo X is alright. One must first identify the weakness, which should be obvious thanks to awesome sound design, and then learn the boss's patterns so its weakness can be exploited. Like I said, the fights are incredibly inconsistent in terms of quality and difficulty, but if there was one definitive area where Metroid Fusion stands above its predecessors, it is the boss design, but there is still room for improvement. So, to wrap things up, after defeating the SAX, the player enters the command room to change the flight path to crash into SR-388 so the spaceship and the X-parasites can be destroyed. This kicks off the usual countdown sequence where Samus must race back to her ship and escape. Only this time, an Omega Metroid is waiting for our heroine. Similar to the Metroid helping Samus defeat Mother Brain, the X-Parasite manifests into another SAX and reveals the Omega Metroid's weakness, an ice beam to the belly. However, it gets rocked by the Omega, reverting it back to its X-Parasite form. Samus can then absorb the final power-up and defeat the final boss of the game. Once complete, Samus escapes, the BSL explodes, and everyone lives happily ever after. At this point, the game tries to be clever, with the AI asking Samus how the ship got restarted manually, and then reveals the rescued animal friends aided in starting the ship, answering a question no one asked. So with that, I must reach some sort of conclusion. When playing Metroid Fusion, I can't help but be reminded of the relationship between Link's Awakening and A Link to the Past. If someone is expecting Link's Awakening to be a portable version of the SNES Classic, they might come out disappointed. Similarly, if one is expecting Metroid Fusion to be a portable version of Super Metroid, they will likely be disappointed. Metroid Fusion is not a miniaturized Super Metroid. The game has new ideas, new concepts, and new gameplay philosophies. I think it's important to review the game on its own merit, regardless of my expectations. Metroid Fusion does not contain a looping open-world environment for the player to explore at their leisure. The different areas are compartmentalized. However, each of the 6 sectors do act like a mini-Metroid in their own right. One might even compare them to a Zelda dungeon. And now that I think about it, if there was to be a reimagining of Zelda 2, this type of design would work perfectly. Each sector is expertly designed, requiring the player to explore, identify inaccessible areas for later, beat a boss, obtain a power-up, and then revisit those past areas once the appropriate power-up is obtained. If that isn't Metroidvania, I don't know what is. Even better is the difficulty progression. The game starts off very hand-holdy, then requires the player to find certain things on their own, before the game turns off all guides entirely, demanding the player use their learned skills to find the way forward. This gentle progression from subservient Samus to independent Samus happens seamlessly, with the difficulty ramping up well before I got bored and disengaged. Metroid Fusion's pacing is damn near perfect. And of course, there is far more story to chew on. While I think the game could be refined to remove the over-explaining, there is plenty of reading between the lines, and I actually found most of the text quite enjoyable on a second playthrough. The writers do a nice job dropping little hints to the ultimate conclusion, and do it quite subtly. While a departure from the nearly textless games before it, I don't mind the change, and I think it is mostly well executed, and blended seamlessly into the gameplay. Finally, I think this is the best looking Metroid of the first 4. The sprite work on the bosses is truly exceptional, and Ridley has never looked better. Same goes for the Omega Metroid and most of the other bosses. This is truly next level stuff, and Metroid Fusion doesn't feel like it could be accomplished on 90s hardware, outside of maybe the Neo Geo. Overall, Metroid Fusion looks terrific. The jumping finally feels tight instead of floaty, the button layout and control scheme is vastly improved, and there are finally some decent boss battles. I also died 4 times on this recorded run, versus 0 in Super Metroid, though I must admit not all deaths felt exactly fair, thanks to a horrendous boss and the fact enemies are stingy with health drops. While I appreciate some may prefer a more open world with their Metroid, with more sequence breaking and freedom, I don't find sequence breaking and freedom is what made Super Metroid so great in the first place. The game is expertly designed, and in this regard, Metroid Fusion follows in the footsteps of its father. Metroid Fusion is expertly designed, with a terrific map system, tangible rewards for exploration, limited backtracking thanks to smart level design, new abilities are communicated to the player through in-game experiences rather than text, and the progression from area to area is intuitive rather than obtuse. Gameplay preferences aside, Metroid Fusion is another amazing entry into the franchise and easily stands toe-to-toe with the iconic Super Metroid. There's just one thing I can't quite understand though. You know what's weird about Metroid Fusion? The wall jump and shine spark are taught to the player on the attract screen.